The storm came the way bad news always did on Harlow, slow enough that you told yourself you had time, and then all at once. I had been the airfield operations officer at Forward Operating Base Harlow for 11 days. 11 days is long enough to learn where the coffee is, and short enough that the men still watch how you carry yourself before they decide what you are. I had decided what I was going to be before I ever set foot on that mountain. Tight. Correct. The kind of officer who does not let the line go soft because the last man let it go soft. My predecessor had been relieved for exactly that, a flight line you could wander onto if you looked busy enough, a cordon that meant nothing, a whole apron of $40 million aircraft guarded by habit instead of by anyone actually saying no. I was going to be the man who said no. So when I came out onto the apron that evening with the light going amber and dirty over the western ridges, and I saw a figure standing inside the cordon by the far revetment where the black bird sat, the first thing I felt was not curiosity. It was the small, hot satisfaction of a man who has just been handed the exact problem he was hired to solve. The black bird. That was what the crews called it, and I had not yet earned the right to know why they said it the way they did, a little lower than they said anything else, the way you say a word in a church. It sat in the last revetment, a night-configured Black Hawk so matte and dark it seemed to drink what light was left, bristling with things the standard birds didn't carry. The long snout of a terrain-following radar, the blistered pods of forward-looking infrared, a refueling probe folded along its flank like the bill of some patient, ugly, magnificent bird. Nobody was assigned to it that I knew of. It had come in on its own 2 days before I arrived, dropped into that revetment, and gone quiet. I had put it on my mental list of things to square away. An aircraft with no visible crew and no clear owner was, to the officer I intended to be, an untidiness. And now there was a person standing next to it, inside my cordon at dusk, with weather coming. I crossed the apron with my collar up against the first spits of rain. She didn't turn as I came. That was the first thing, she didn't turn. Everyone turns when boots come across an apron behind them. It's older than training, that turn, it's in the spine. She just stood there with her hands loose at her sides, looking up into the west, at the ridgeline where the cloud was pouring over the saddle like something spilled. A flight suit, dark, no patches I could read in that light. Hair pulled back, gone mostly gray at the temple, cut plain. Weathered face. Older than me by a good 15 years, I guessed, and something in the stillness of her that I read, God forgive me, as the stillness of a person who did not have anywhere to be. That was the story I built in the 2 seconds it took to reach her, and I built it fast and complete the way you do when you've already decided. A contractor's wife who'd wandered from the DFAC. Some support element who'd followed the wrong sergeant out to the line. A civilian. Someone who did not belong within 100 meters of the aircraft I was responsible for, and who was, right now, standing close enough to the black bird to put a hand on its skin. Ma'am, I said it the way you say a word you intend to be a door closing. This is a restricted cordon. I'm going to need you to clear the flight line. She looked at the ridge a moment longer, then she looked at me. I want to be precise about this, because I have gone over it many times since, and the temptation is to say her eyes told me something, to say I felt a chill, to give myself the dignity of a warning I ignored. I felt no warning. Her eyes were pale and steady and tired, and they moved over me once, top to bottom, the way you'd read a form you'd read 1,000 times before, not unkind, not challenging, just quick and complete and done. And then she looked back at the ridge, and she said, in a voice with no heat in it at all, "Weather's going to close the saddle in about 40 minutes. I did not care what the weather was going to do to the saddle. I cared that a civilian was standing in my cordon telling me about it. I understand, I said, which was a lie of the kind officers tell to keep their voice level. You still need to clear the line. Now, please. Here is where I have to tell it against myself, because there is no honest way to tell it otherwise. She didn't argue. That should have told me something, and it told me nothing. People who don't belong argue, they explain, they name drop, they get flustered or indignant or apologetic. They do the whole performance of the person caught somewhere they shouldn't be. She did none of it. She turned from the ridge, unhurried, and she took 2 steps back from the aircraft, putting herself outside the painted line at the edge of the revetment. And then she stopped there at the edge and folded her arms and went back to watching the sky. She had complied with the letter of what I said and none of the spirit of it, and she had done it so smoothly that I stood there for a second not sure I'd been obeyed or handled. It was the move of someone who had been ordered around by nervous young men holding clipboards more times than she could count, and had long ago stopped spending any energy on it. Who gave you the compliance you were technically owed, and not 1 gram more. Ma'am, my voice went flatter. Off the flight line, this isn't a viewing area. I'm where you told me to be, she said, not looking at me. Outside the line. A pause, rain ticking on the revetment's steel. You want me off the airfield, that's a different order. You can give it, but you might want to hold it about 10 minutes. And why is that? Because I think you're about to need this aircraft, she said, and I'm the only one on this base who can fly it. I almost laughed. I want to be honest about that too. It came up in me, the laugh, that reflexive contempt a certain kind of tired young officer keeps loaded. The woman in the unmarked flight suit, gray at the temples, standing in the rain telling me she flew the meanest, blackest, most classified airframe on the field. It was, I thought, the saddest thing I'd seen in 11 days. Some hanger-on who'd been around aircraft long enough to have caught the language, and now stood on a flight line at dusk, telling stories to herself. I'm going to need your ID, I said, and I'm going to need you to walk with me. She turned her head then and looked at me full, and there was still no heat in her face, but there was something else now, something patient and very old and a little bit sorry, not sorry for herself. Sorry for me, I understood later. Sorry for what the next 10 minutes were going to do to the tidy picture I'd built. Captain, she said, reading my rank off my chest in the gloom the way she'd read the whole of me a minute before. What's your name? Corbin, I said, before I could decide whether to. Corbin, she nodded, filing it. Okay, give me your order, Corbin, or hold it, but I'd hold it. She looked back to the ridge, to the cloud coming over the saddle like a slow gray flood. Because there are 11 men on the far side of that weather and it's going to close, and when it closes the only way anybody's getting to them tonight is a bird that can fly the valley on instruments in the dark. There's one of those on this base. She tipped her chin, a fraction, toward the black shape behind the line. And there's one person cleared to fly it below these minimums. She didn't tip her chin at herself. She didn't need to, so, your call. I opened my mouth to end it, to call for the security element, to walk her off, to be the officer I had decided to be. And that was when the klaxon went. I need to back up and tell you about the 11 men, because I didn't know about them yet when I was standing in the rain being sure of myself, and everything I did wrong I did in the gap between the world I thought I was in and the one I was actually in. They were a reconnaissance element, a small team, long range, the kind of men who go out past the last friendly thing on the map and live for days in a hide watching a road or a valley or a house, and come back gray and thinned and quiet. 11 of them had gone out 4 nights before into the high country north of the saddle, up where the mountains folded into a country of stone and thin air, and weather that made its own rules. They had done their work. They were coming out. And on the way out, on a goat track above a valley the maps called Nothing and the crews called the Bowl, one of them had put a foot wrong in the dark on wet rock and gone down 40 feet into the scree. And the fall had opened him up inside in the way falls do. Nothing you can see, everything you can't. A belly filling with blood and a clock running. So the 11 men were now 10 men and a litter, pinned in the bowl. The bowl was a closed cup of rock, a high glacial basin ringed on 3 sides by walls that went up past where a helicopter wanted to be, with one throat of a valley leading out to the south and the saddle above it. In daylight, in good weather, it was a hard pickup and a good crew could do it. At night, in a storm, with the ceiling coming down to the ridgelines and the throat of the valley filling with cloud. It was the kind of place you looked at on a chart and felt your stomach drop. I learned all of this in the next 90 seconds, the way you learn things in an operations center when a mission goes from routine to bad, in fragments over voices, off a map that suddenly has too many red marks on it. The klaxon had pulled me off the apron and into the TOC at a run. The woman forgotten, the tidy little disciplinary problem of her wiped clean out of my head by the size of what was on the screens. The battle captain was a major named Fenn, a good officer, and I watched him age about a year in those 90 seconds. The wounded man's vitals were coming down the chain from the team medic in the kind of clipped, careful voice men use when they are terrified and refuse to sound it. Blood pressure falling. The medic had done what a medic can do in a rock bowl with a belly bleed, which is buy time and pray. The team leader's assessment, relayed up, was as plain as a headstone. Their man had hours, not a night. If he wasn't on a surgeon's table by somewhere around midnight, he would not be on one at all. And the weather was closing the door. "Where's our lift?" Fenn said to the room, to the radios, to God. "Working it, sir," someone said, which is what you say when it isn't working. I found a place along the back wall and made myself small and useful, doing the ops officer things, pulling the field status, the fuel state, the crew rest board, and telling myself I was contributing. And the whole time some small cold voice at the back of my skull was saying, 40 minutes. She said the saddle closes in 40 minutes. She said 11 men. She said the only bird that can fly the valley in the dark. I told the small cold voice to be quiet. There is a special stubbornness in a man who has just been wrong and doesn't know it yet, and I had it in full. They tried. I want that on the record because it would be easy to tell this story as if the crews of Harlow were cowards, and they were not. They were the opposite of cowards. What they were was correct. The first crew up was a standard medevac bird and a good young pilot named Ackley, and Fenn put the mission to him fast and clean, and Ackley took it and ran for his aircraft, and for about 4 minutes the TOC breathed a little easier because something was moving. Then the weather brief caught up with the tasking. The ceiling in the objective area was reported at, and then below, the tops of the ridges that ringed the bowl. The throat of the valley, the one way in, was filling with cloud from the floor up. Winds at altitude were building past what the charts wanted, gusting, shearing, the kind of moving air that comes off a mountain in a storm and grabs a helicopter and shakes it like a dog with a rag. Ackley got his bird turning and got it to a hover, and got about a mile toward the ridgeline and flew into a wall of gray that took the ground away and the horizon away, and left him inside a ping-pong ball at night in the mountains. And he did the bravest and most correct thing a young pilot can do in that moment, which is he admitted it. His voice came over the net tight and controlled. He could not maintain visual reference, he could not see the terrain, and to press further was to fly a fully loaded aircraft into a mountain he could no longer see. He turned back. He came home. He walked into the TOC white around the mouth, and nobody said a word to him, because everybody in that room who had ever flown knew he had just done a harder thing than pressing on would have been. The second crew scrubbed before they launched, when the fuller weather picture came in. The third bird was a heavier aircraft with a better instrument suite and a senior aircraft commander, a chief warrant officer named Das with more hours than the rest of the room combined, and everyone looked to Das the way you look to the best man in the room when the room is out of ideas. Das studied the charts and the weather and the terrain for a long, silent minute. And then he took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, and said the thing that I think cost him more than pressing on would have cost him. "I can't fly that valley on instruments in this," Das said. "Not into a closed bowl with walls I can't see and a ceiling on the deck. I'd be guessing. You don't guess with 11 men and a full crew in the back. I'm sorry. It's below anything I can do and bring them home. It's below minimums for any airframe and any crew on this base." The room went quiet. Not a defeated quiet, a working quiet. A bunch of professionals turning over a problem that had no good face. Fenn stood over the map with both hands flat on the table and his head down, and I watched him do the math that commanders have to do and hate. The math where you weigh the near certainty of losing one man against the possibility of losing a whole crew and aircraft trying to reach him, and you carry the answer alone. "Then we hold for a weather window," Fenn said quietly, "and we pray it comes before midnight." Everyone in that room knew it wasn't coming before midnight. The storm was a night-long storm. That was the math, and the math was a death sentence, and we all stood there inside it. And then a voice came down from higher. It came over the command net, from the regional operations center 2 valleys and 1 echelon above us. A colonel's voice, gravel and calm. A man who had clearly just been read the same death sentence we were all standing inside and had refused to sign it. "Harlow," the colonel said, "this is Steelyard 6. Say your status on the Bowl Exfil." Fenn keyed up and gave it to him straight. 3 crews, all scrubbed, weather below minimums for every airframe and aviator on the base. No window before the patient's clock ran out. He said it like a man reporting a death, because he was. There was a pause on the net, a long one, the kind of pause where you can hear a senior man deciding whether to accept the world as it has been described to him. "Harlow," Steelyard 6 said, "is the 01 aircraft on your field?" I saw Fenn's head come up. I saw a couple of the older warrant officers along the wall go still in a particular way. I did not know what the 01 aircraft was. I know now. It was the Black Bird, the one in the last revetment, the one I had been about to have towed off my apron as an untidiness. "Affirm," Fenn said, slower now. 01 is on the field, 2 days, no tasking. We've had no—" he stopped. "Steelyard, we have no assigned crew for that airframe on station." Another pause, and then the colonel said a thing that changed the temperature of the entire room by about 10 degrees, said it flat, the way you say a fact you're certain of. "You've got the crew," Steelyard 6 said. "Nighthawk came in with that bird. Nighthawk's on your field. Put the Bowl Exfil to Nighthawk." I did not understand what happened in the TOC in the next 3 seconds, because I did not have the context to understand it, but I felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure. I watched a room full of tired, defeated professionals go absolutely silent, not the working quiet from before, a different quiet, a whole other order of quiet. I watched Das, the best pilot on the base, the man who had just said it couldn't be done, turn his head toward the door of the TOC with an expression I could not read and did not like the weight of. I watched 2 of the young crew chiefs along the wall look at each other. And I watched Major Fenn, a good officer, a hard officer, a man who had just been carrying the deaths of 11 men on his shoulders. I watched something come into his face that I can only call hope, and under the hope, a kind of chagrin, as if he'd been reminded of a thing he should never have let himself forget. "Nighthawk," Fenn said into the net, and his voice had changed. "Say again, Steelyard. Confirm you're releasing the Bowl Exfil to Nighthawk." "Confirmed," said the colonel. "It's her call whether it can be flown. Nobody else's. Put it to her and stand out of her way." "Sorry." I heard the word and something turned over in my stomach, slow and cold and terrible, because I was already turning toward the door, and I already knew, with the sick certainty of a man watching his own mistake arrive, exactly who I was going to see standing in it. She was standing in it, the woman from the flight line, the gray at the temple, the unmarked suit, the still face, the civilian I had ordered off my cordon 11 minutes before. She was standing in the doorway of the TOC with the rain coming off her shoulders, and she had clearly been standing there long enough to hear all of it. The 3 scrubbed crews, Das saying it couldn't be done, the death sentence, the colonel's voice, and she had not said one word, had not stepped in, had not spared herself the picture of a room full of men deciding 11 others had to die. And when the whole room turned and found her in the door, nobody in it laughed. Nobody said, "Who's that?" Nobody asked her for ID. The oldest warrant officer on the wall, a man with hash marks up his whole sleeve, came to his feet without seeming to decide to. Das looked at her and said one word low, and the word was, Vera. And Major Fenn, my battle captain, my superior, a man I'd watched command that room with total authority for 2 hours, Major Fenn straightened up off the map table and said, in a voice I had not heard him use, Chief Locke, we've got a bad one. The name went through me like cold water. Chief. Chief Warrant Officer. And not just a chief, I would learn within the hour that Chief Warrant Officer 5 Vera Locke was, in that theater close to a legend, the pinnacle grade of Army aviation, 30 years and more in the seat, the pilot they sent when the mission had already been called impossible by everyone else, and that the call sign the whole room had gone silent for Nighthawk, was not a story a lonely woman told herself on a flight line at dusk. It was hers. It had been hers for longer than I had been alive, more or less, and men in that theater said it the way the crews said the black bird, a little lower than they said anything else. I had ordered her off the flight line. I had asked her for her ID. I had built her in 2 seconds into a hanger-on with nowhere to be, and I had been so pleased with myself for it. She stepped into the room. She didn't look at me. I was, in that moment, the least important thing in the building, and she treated me exactly as important as I was, which is to say not at all. She walked to the map table, and Fenn and Das made room for her without being asked, and she put one weathered hand flat on the chart over the bowl and looked down at it the way she'd looked at the ridge, quick and complete, and she said, "Talk to me about the throat." "To me about the throat," she said again, and it was Das who answered her, and I want to mark that, because Das was the best pilot on that base, and 10 minutes earlier he had been the final authority in the room, and now he stood at her shoulder and briefed her like a wingman. "Throat runs south-southwest out of the bowl," Das said, tracing it with a knuckle. "About 3 miles of it before it opens to the saddle. Walls tight, I make it 400 meters across at the narrows, less where it kinks. It kinks twice. Here." He touched a place where the contour lines crowded together like a fist closing. "And here. The floor climbs the whole way in, so you're threading a rising slot, ceilings on the rigid tops and coming down. Winds aloft out of the northwest, 30 gusting 50, and they'll be doing things in that slot I can't predict. Rotor wash off the walls, shear at the kinks." He straightened. "That's why I turned it down, Vera. It's not the bowl, it's the throat. You can't see the throat and you can't fly what you can't see." She had not looked up from the chart the whole time he spoke. Her finger was resting on the first kink. "You fly it on the box," she said. "It wasn't a question. Terrain following. You let the radar see the throat and you fly the picture, not the window." "On instruments in that slot at night in shear," Das said, and there was no argument in it, only the weight of a man laying out exactly how far past the edge of the possible she was proposing to go. One bad return off a wall, one late correction at a kink. You're carrying 11 souls in the back and a crew of 4. There's no margin. There's no room to be 6 feet wrong. "Then I won't be 6 feet wrong," she said. She said it the way you'd say the sky was gray. Not a boast. I have turned it over many times and there was no boast anywhere in it. A boast is a thing you say to change how people see you. She wasn't trying to change how anyone saw her. She was stating a specification, the way a machinist tells you a tolerance, and the specification happened to be her. And the terrible, humbling thing, standing in the back of that room with my face still hot from the flight line, was that I watched every experienced man in it hear her say I won't be 6 feet wrong, and I watched them believe her. Not hope. Believe. Das nodded slowly, the way you nod when someone has answered the objection you knew they'd answer, and stepped back and gave her the table. She spent the next 4 minutes doing the least dramatic thing I have ever watched a hero do, and it is the reason I can tell this story at all, because if she had run for the aircraft on a wave of courage I would have understood it as luck and it would have proved nothing. She did not run anywhere. She stood at the map and she took the whole problem apart into small, cold, solvable pieces, out loud, so her crew could hold each piece with her. Fuel first. She asked for the exact fuel state on the 01 aircraft and got it, and I watched her do the arithmetic without a calculator. Weight against distance against the climb into the bowl against a hover at that altitude, which eats fuel the way a fire eats paper, against the reserve to get home if the saddle sealed behind her and she had to go the long way. Pull 400 pounds, she said. I don't want the weight and I won't need the range if I fly it right, and if I fly it wrong the extra fuel just makes a bigger fire. She said that last part without any drama at all, the plainest acknowledgement of death I ever heard, and moved on. Wait next. 11 men plus a litter plus their kit at altitude in thin air. She stripped the aircraft in her head, asked what non-essential gear was aboard, ordered 2 things pulled, calculated her power margin at the hover in the bowl's altitude and the storm's cold, dense than thin confusion of air, and set a hard number. She would go in heavy on nobody's schedule but the aircraft's. I hover, I load, I go. Nobody rushes me into pulling more power than the air will give me. I'd rather make 2 trips than 1 smoking hole. Then the ingress. She walked the throat on the chart with DOS, kink by kink, and she did a thing I didn't understand until later. She wasn't memorizing the terrain. She was memorizing the radar picture of the terrain, building in her head the sequence of returns she would see on her display so that when the world outside the windscreen was solid gray, she would be flying a map she already had by heart. First kink comes up about 90 seconds after I enter the slot at my ingress speed. It'll show as a wall closing from the right. I brake left early, before the return says to, because the shear at the kink will push me right and I want to be already leaning off it. Second kink's tighter and it's a right brake, and the floor's risen so I'm climbing through it. She was flying it already in the room, eyes half closed, one hand moving a few inches through the air over the map in the small, precise motions of a person who has done a thing 10,000 times and is doing it once more in her mind before she does it for real. And her crew formed around her while she did it. That was the other thing I watched. A co-pilot came in from somewhere, a younger warrant and 2 crew chiefs. The Black Bird had a crew after all, they'd been in their tent, and they came awake and assembled around her in minutes with the quiet economy of people who had done this with her before. Nobody briefed them on who was in charge. Nobody had to. She gave the co-pilot the fuel and the power numbers to hold her to. She gave the crew chiefs the load plan and the one rule that mattered: you are my eyes down and back. If a wall comes up on your side, you call it in feet and clock, not adjectives. Rock, 4 o'clock, 30 feet, closing. I'll fly the words. And they said, yes, Chief, the way you say something you'd stake your life on, which they were about to. She never raised her voice. She never said anything about the 11 men, or courage, or duty, or any of the words a lesser telling would put in her mouth. She solved the problem. And the solving of it, the sheer methodical competence of it, did more to settle that room than any speech could have. Men who had been standing inside a death sentence 10 minutes before were now moving with purpose, because the one person who could fly it had looked at the impossible thing and taken it apart into pieces small enough to carry. Fenn caught her arm once, briefly. As she turned for the door, not to stop her, I think just to be, for 1 second, a man touching the sleeve of the person who was about to do the thing. Vera, he said low, it's your call. Nobody in this theater will say a word if you look at that weather and call it. It's your call and only yours. She looked at him, and for the first time something moved in her face that wasn't stillness, something older and warmer and sadder, the look of a person who has made this call more times than anybody should have to. There are 10 men holding their friend together with their hands in a rock bowl in the dark, she said, and they're waiting to hear a rotor. It's not my call, Major. It stopped being my call the second I heard there was nobody else. She pulled her sleeve free gently. Get me current winds at the saddle the moment I'm airborne, and get that boy a surgeon warmed up. I'm bringing him to you. And she walked out into the storm. I followed her. I had no business following her. I was the ops officer who tried to have her towed off the field. I had no role in that launch. But I followed her out into the rain because I could not have stayed in that room, and nobody stopped me. And I think some part of me needed to see with my own eyes the aircraft turn that I had, hours before, filed as an untidiness. The apron had changed. The rain was coming hard now, driven flat, and the light was gone entirely, and the black bird sat in its revetment lit by the shielded worklights of the ground crew, who had appeared from nowhere and were swarming it with the fast, quiet urgency of people preparing a thing they love and fear for a hard night. The refueling probe. The auxiliary tanks topping and then, on her order, drawing back down to her number. The rotor blades untied. The whole machine coming up out of its stillness into a thing that ticked and hissed and strained to be let go. She did her walk around in the rain and the dark with a red-lensed light, unhurried, complete, running a gloved hand along a leading edge, crouching under the tail, pressing a thumb against a fitting. A woman past 50 in a soaked flight suit going over 4 tons of aircraft with the patience of someone who has buried people who skipped a step. She did not skip a step. The storm screamed at her and she checked her aircraft as if she had all the time in the world because she understood, the way the great ones understand, that the time to be fast is never during the walk around. The time to be fast is later, and only if you've been slow now. Then she climbed up into the right seat, and the door slid shut, and the black bird began to wind up. I have seen a lot of helicopters start. I had never heard one sound like a held breath. The turbines caught and rose through their scream and the rotor started to turn, slow, then a blur, then that deep chopping thunder that you feel in the wall of your chest before you hear it, and the whole aircraft settled onto its struts and then got light on them, straining, the way a horse gets light before it runs. The wash came off it and drove the rain sideways across the apron in sheets, and I put my arm up against it and did not step back, because I wanted the storm and the wash and the thunder of it on my skin. I wanted to feel the size of the thing I had almost sent away. Das had come out to stand beside me. I didn't hear him arrive. I felt him there, a big still shape in the driven rain, watching the bird come up with an expression I could see even in that light. A man watching another do the thing he had judged, correctly and honorably, to be beyond him. "She'll fly it," Das said, more to himself than to me. Then, after a moment, louder over the thunder, "You're the new ops officer, Corbin." "Yes." "You put her off the line." He didn't ask it. Word travels fast on a small base and it had beaten the storm. There was no cruelty in how he said it and somehow that was worse. Figured she was astray. I didn't answer. There was no answer that wasn't smaller than the truth. Das watched the bird a while longer. The nose came around. She was pointing herself down the apron into the wind. 31 years I've known that call sign, he said. Flew as her wingman twice a long time ago in a worse place than this. You want to know what NIGHTHAWK means? He didn't wait for me to say yes. It means she flies the nights nobody else will. That's all. That's the whole legend. Everybody else is grounded, weather's on the deck, ceilings below the ridges, and command puts out the word and the word is her call sign, and it means the mission's still on because she'll still go. 31 years. She has flown into places to pull men out that no aircraft had any business being, and she has done it by being so good, so precise, so completely without ego about it, that the impossible just becomes a series of things she does correctly in a row. He looked at me then, finally, rain running off the brim of him. And you saw a gray-haired woman in an unmarked suit and figured she was lost. Yes, I said, because he had earned the truth and I had earned the saying of it. I did. Well, Das looked back at the bird. Watch then, this is the part you'll tell your grandkids about and they won't believe you. His voice roughened. I sure as hell won't forget it. I told them it couldn't be flown. I meant it. It can't be flown. He nodded at the black shape straining against the earth. By me, by anybody on this field, by anybody I've ever met but her. The black bird lifted. It didn't leap. That's the thing I remember, the thing that told me more about her than anything else that night. It didn't rocket up and bank away in a young man's climb. It came off the apron slow and dead level, deliberate, 4 tons of aircraft rising into a screaming crosswind as smooth as an elevator. No wasted motion, no drama, the machine an extension of the woman flying it. It rose to 50 feet, and the nose dipped a precise few degrees, and it began to move forward, gathering. And it slid out over the wire and the revetments, and into the black wall of the storm to the north. Its lights swallowed almost at once, until there was nothing but the fatting thunder of it, and the rain, and the two of us standing on the apron looking at the place where it had gone. "Come on," Das said. "TOC. I'm not watching this from out here, and neither should you." He put a hand on my shoulder, not gently. "You're going to hear what flying looks like when there's nobody left to do it but the best there is. Pay attention, Captain. It's an expensive education, and somebody else is paying the tuition." TOC had gone to red light and low voices. Everyone who didn't have a job was against the walls, and everyone who did have a job did it in a murmur, because the only thing anybody in that room wanted to hear was the net. And the net, for a long while, gave us almost nothing. That was the hardest part. I hadn't expected the silence of it. In the movies, a thing like this is wall-to-wall radio chatter. It wasn't. She flew mostly quiet because talking wasn't flying, and every word that did come down the net was stripped to the bone. Her co-pilot read her the numbers. The crew chiefs, when they spoke in that flat Fitan clock language she'd ordered. And her own voice, when we heard it, was so level and unhurried that the first few times I couldn't match it to what I knew was happening on the other end of it. That this calm woman reading back a heading was doing it while threading a blacked-out slot of rock at 100-some knots on instruments in sheer. "Entering the throat," she said. Just that. And Fenn's hands went flat on the map table again, and the whole room leaned a quarter-inch toward the speaker. I could not see what she saw. I have spent a lot of the years since trying to imagine it, and I've talked to enough aviators to build a picture, and the picture is this: a windscreen full of nothing. Not darkness, darkness has depth. Gray. A solid, streaming, textureless gray, the landing light thrown back off the rain and cloud-like headlights in fog so that turning it on made it worse. No horizon. No up that your body could trust, only the up the instruments insisted on. And in that nothing, on a small green display, the radar painting the throat ahead of her in returns, a wall here, a rising floor there, the slot bending, a picture of a world she could not see out the window. And her job was to fly the picture and never once let her animal brain, screaming at her that this was wrong, that you cannot fly through a mountain, take the controls back from the cold part of her mind that knew she could. "First kink," her co-pilot said, quiet, a warning. "I have it," she said. And then a crew chief's voice, tight but disciplined, exactly as she'd trained him. "Rock, 3 o'clock, 40 feet, closing." "Braking left," she said. And there was the smallest change in the engine note that came down the open mic, the aircraft leaning into a turn she was making early, before the wall told her to, because she'd briefed in that room an hour ago that the shear at the kink would shove her right, and she wanted to already be leaning off it when it hit. And then it hit. You could hear it, a sudden hard buffet, a change in the whole texture of the sound, the storm getting its hands on 4 tons of aircraft, and trying to throw it against a wall it couldn't see, and her voice came over the top of it, not louder, just present, saying, "There it is." Almost fond, the way you'd greet a hard thing you'd been expecting, and the engine note swelled as she fed in power and held it. Held the aircraft in the center of a slot of rock while the wind tried to spend it against the stone, and the buffet eased, and the crew chief said, "Walls opening. Clear right," and she said, "Moving on." I realized I was gripping the edge of a map table hard enough to hurt. I made myself let go. Across the table, Fenn had his eyes closed, and his lips were moving very slightly, and I don't think he knew he was doing it. "That's the shear she briefed," Das murmured beside me. His arms were crossed and his jaw was set, and he was watching the speaker as if he could see her through it. "She called it in the TOC an hour ago. Break early, lean off the kink. She's flying the plan she built on the map. That's the whole thing, Captain. That's the difference between her and the rest of us. We'd be reacting to that slot. She's remembering it." He shook his head slowly. "She flew that valley in her head before she ever left the ground, and now she's just matching it." "Second kink coming," the co-pilot said. 90 seconds, floors rising." Climbing, she said. Watch my power. Power's good, you've got margin. Rock 9 o'clock, 50 feet. The other crew chief now the left side, closing slow. Breaking right, climbing through it, she said. And this time the change in the sound was bigger. The engines winding up harder as she asked the aircraft to turn and climb at once in air that was trying to do the opposite, the whole airframe laboring. And for about 4 seconds the net gave us nothing but the strain of it, the deep chop of the rotor and the scream of the turbines and the wind, and every soul in that TOC stopped breathing. And I understood for the first time in my life what it means to have your heart in your throat, because mine was there. I could feel it beating in the base of my tongue. Through, she said. The room let its breath out all at once, a single ragged sound, and Finn said, come on, under it, and she was already talking again, flat and unhurried. Second kinks behind me, slots opening, I have the bowl on radar. A pause. Get me those men on the net, I want to talk to whoever's got eyes up. And that somehow undid me more than the flying had. That in the middle of it, having just threaded 2 blacked-out kinks of a mountain slot in a storm, the first thing she reached for was the voice of a frightened man in a rock bowl, because she knew, of course she knew, 31 years of it, that the 10 men holding their friend together in the dark had been listening to that rotor come and go on the wind for the last several minutes, growing and fatting and growing, not knowing if it was coming for them or turning back like the others surely had. And that the kindest and most tactically sound thing she could do was put her own voice in their ears and tell them she was real. Recon element, this is Nighthawk. Her voice went, if anything, gentler. I'm in your valley, coming up the slot to you now. Talk to me about your bowl and your patient, nice and slow. I've got all night. She didn't have all night. She had maybe 8 minutes of fuel margin and a dying man's clock and a storm getting worse. I've got all night. I have thought about those 4 words more than almost anything else from that night. They were a lie, and they were the truest thing she could have said, and she said them in a voice with a smile somewhere down inside it, to men who needed to hear that somebody unhurried and competent had finally come. And I heard, faint and broken under the static, a young man's voice come back saying, copy, Nighthawk, God, it's good to hear you, and crack on the last word and steady himself, and start to give her the picture. The bowl, when she came up into it, tried to kill her a different way than the throat had. The throat was a knife fight in a hallway, tight, fast, over quickly. The bowl was slower and in some ways worse. It was a closed cup of rock, and she had to bring the aircraft up into it and stop it and hold it dead still in the air over a scree slope, while the crew got the patient and the men aboard. A hover, at altitude, at night, in a storm, ringed by walls she couldn't see, in air that was pouring over those walls and down into the cup and doing things no chart could predict. A hover is the hardest thing a helicopter does even in perfect conditions. It is the aircraft holding itself up on a column of its own violence with nothing to lean on. To hold one there, in that, for the minutes it takes to load 11 men, was the part Das had said he couldn't do, and standing in the TOC listening to her do it, I understood why. Because she couldn't see the ground. The team had one small infrared strobe, and she came to it out of the cloud, and then had to hold station on it, and on the radar returns off the walls and on the crew chief's voices, all at once, blending 3 imperfect pictures into one place in the air and staying there, while the downdrafts came off the ridges and tried to drop her into the scree, and the updrafts tried to throw her into a wall, and the whole aircraft wanted, second by second, to go somewhere she would not let it go. Holding 40 feet, her co-pilot read. 30, she's got it. Hold, chief, hold. Wall 6 o'clock, 60 feet, a crew chief. Rock below coming up on the slope 30 feet, 20. I see the slope, she said. Holding. And the engine note swelled and sank and swelled in tiny increments. A woman playing the collective and the pedals and the cyclic in 1,000 small corrections a minute, each one a decision, each one the difference between a rescue and a fireball, and doing it so continuously and so smoothly that it stopped sounding like corrections and started sounding like one long-held note, the aircraft singing in place against everything the mountain threw at it. "First 4 coming aboard," a crew chief said. Then seconds later, 4 aboard, litter next. Easy, easy, litter's coming up. And under it, faint, we could hear the actual sounds now. The open mic catching the cabin, boots on the deck, a grunt. The medic's voice fast and clipped. The wind howling in the open door. The real texture of 10 men getting their wounded friend and then themselves up a scree slope and into a hovering aircraft in a storm. In the dark, with the rotor tips a handful of feet from the rock on one side, trusting the whole of their lives to the woman holding it there. Litters aboard, patients in, medics on him. The crew chief's voice and then a catch in it. "Chief, that's we got a wall coming, gust off the ridge, 4 o'clock. "I feel it," she said, and the engines wound up hard, and the whole net filled with the strain of the aircraft fighting a downdraft. And her co-pilot's voice went up half an octave saying, "Power, watch your power you're at." And she said over him, calm, absolute, "I have it, feed me the last of them, don't stop." And someone in the TOC said, "Jesus," very quietly, and Finn said, let her fly to no one." Because there was nothing any of us could do but stand in a red-lit room 2 valleys away and listen to a woman hold an aircraft in the sky by main strength and skill and refuse to let a mountain have it. "Last man aboard," the crew chief nearly shouted. "That's 11. 11 and the patient, doors coming closed, everybody's in, chief, everybody's in, Geo." "Coming out," Vera Locke said. And her voice, God help me, had not changed. Not through the throat, not through the hover, not now. The same level, unhurried, weather-bitten calm she'd used to tell me the saddle would close in 40 minutes, standing in the rain, being a person I'd decided didn't belong. 11 men and a dying boy in the back of her aircraft. A bowl of rock trying to kill her. A storm at its worst. The hardest flying of a 31-year career. And she said, coming out, the way you'd say you were stepping out for air. The way out should have been the easy part, and it was the worst part. And she'd known it would be. And that's why she'd pulled the 400 pounds of fuel and stripped the weight. An hour ago, in a warm room, while I stood in the back still half thinking she was somebody's lost wife. Because now she was heavy. Now she had 11 men and a litter and all their kit, and she had to fly the rising, kinking, blacked-out slot again, downhill this time, which sounds easier and isn't, because now the throat was funneling the storm at her, and she was flying a loaded aircraft down through sheer with less power margin and less fuel, and a patient in the back whose clock was the whole reason for any of it. "Fuel," she said once, and her co-pilot gave her a number, and there was a silence on the net, and then she said, "Okay, that's enough if I don't waste any. Nobody talks to me unless it's a wall or a number until we're out of the slot." And nobody did. I have never in my life listened to anything the way that room listened to the next 4 minutes. The net gave us almost nothing. The crew chief's flat calls, rock, 2 o'clock, 40 feet, the co-pilot's numbers, the engine note rising and falling as she fed and eased power through the kinks she now took in reverse, breaking early off each one exactly as she had going in, flying the map in her head backward, and the storm buffeting the aircraft and her holding it, holding it, holding it. Once there was a gust that came down the net as a great tearing shudder and a warning tone somewhere in the cockpit and her co-pilot saying a word I won't repeat, and then her voice flat. I've got it, easing right. And the shudder passing, and Das beside me let out a breath he'd been holding so long it shook. "Second kink," her co-pilot said. "Last one, floor's dropping away after this." "Braking left," she said. "Climbing no, holding, rocks high on the left, I'm going under the sheer." A pause that lasted a year. "There, slots opening." And then, after a silence, "I'm out of the throat, I have the saddle," a beat. "Saddle's closing, but I've got a lane, taking it." And then for the first time in the whole flight something came into her voice that hadn't been there before, not relief. She was too far from home for relief, but a kind of settling, the sound of a person who has flown through the eye of the thing and out the far side of the worst of it. Harlow Nighthawk. I'm feet dry over the saddle with 11 souls and 1 urgent surgical. Coming home. Have the surgeon standing and have a crew meet me on the pad. I'm not shutting down. I want him inside while the blades are still turning. A pause. And somebody tell that boy's mother someday that 10 of his friends carried him up a mountain in the dark and wouldn't leave him. That's the story. Not me. Them. Nighthawk out. The TOC did not cheer. I had expected, if this moment came, a cheer. It didn't come. What happened instead was quieter, and I have never forgotten it. Men put their hands over their mouths, or their faces, or the backs of their necks, and turned away from each other for a second the way men do when they will not be seen. And Major Fenn sat down. Just sat down flat in a chair as if his legs had been taken out from under him, and pressed the heels of both hands into his eyes. And Das beside me said, in a wrecked voice, to no one, 31 years, and could not say the rest of it. She brought the black bird home 20 minutes later. I went out to the pad. Everyone did. The rain had gentled to a steady falling, and the wind had dropped from a scream to a moan, and the whole base, everyone not standing a post, and some who were and shouldn't have left it, came out into the wet dark and stood along the edge of the pad and the taxiway and the apron, and nobody had ordered it, and nobody said anything. And I have been at ceremonies designed for years to produce the feeling that gathered on that pad by itself in about 90 seconds. We heard her before we saw her. The chop of the rotor came over the southern ridge, steady now, no longer fighting, the sound of an aircraft with the hard part behind it, and then her lights came out of the low cloud, and the black bird slid down the sky toward us dead level and dead smooth. The same way it had left, no drama in it. A woman setting 4 tons of aircraft and 11 lives down onto a wet pad in a mountain night as gently as you'd set down something asleep. The wheels touched. The surgical team was already moving before the aircraft had fully settled, low under the turning blades, a litter and a knot of running figures. And the cabin door was open, and hands were passing the wounded man out into other hands. And the medic was talking fast the whole way. And then they had him, and they were running him for the aid station, with the blades still turning exactly as she'd asked. And the boy who had gone 40 feet down a scree slope 4 hours before, and started dying, was going to a surgeon's table with his blood pressure still readable, because a woman I had ordered off my flight line had flown a valley in the dark that no one else on Earth in reach would fly. The other men came out after, the recon element, 10 of them, and they came down out of that cabin slow, the way men move when they have been holding themselves at a pitch for days and can finally, barely, stop, filthy, gray-faced, swaying a little. One of them going straight to his knees on the wet concrete, not from injury but from the sheer letting go of it, and another crouching to him with a hand on his back. Hard men. The hardest we had. And I watched more than one of them, once they were clear of the disc, turn back toward the aircraft and look up at the right side window where she sat, and I watched what they did. They didn't cheer either. One of them, the team leader I think, straightened himself up out of his exhaustion by main force, and faced the aircraft, and brought his hand up slow, and held a salute on that dark window in the falling rain. And then the man on his knees got himself up and did the same. And then all of them, all 10, in no order and on no command, stood in a ragged line in the rain streaming off them and held a salute on the woman still strapped into the seat. And she could not return it, her hands were full. She was still flying, blades still turning, running the shutdown checks that keep an aircraft from becoming a fire. So she did the only thing she could. Through the wet glass, lit green by her own instruments, I saw her lift 2 fingers off the collective, just 2 fingers, a small tired precise motion, and touch them to her brow, and hold them there a moment and take them away. And that was when the base stood. I don't know how else to say it. There was no order, there was no bugle. But all down that pad and that apron in the rain, the men and women of forward operating base Harlow came to attention as the Blackbird wound down, not because anyone told them to, but because there are moments a body will not sit through, and this was one, and I came to attention with them, and I have never in my life been prouder to be part of a thing and more ashamed of my own small self inside it, both at once, standing in the rain with my hand at my brow and my face wet with more than the rain. Saluting a window I had, 6 hours before, wanted towed off my apron. Das stood beside me at attention, rigid, staring at the aircraft. He didn't lower his hand until the rotor stopped. Nobody did. She shut it down. The blades slowed and drooped and stopped, and the turbines wound down through their scream to a whine to a tick, and the storm sound came back up into the space the engines left, and the crowd began, slowly, to loosen, to become people again, to move. And I stood on the edge of the pad and watched the cockpit door slide open and watched Chief Warrant Officer 5 Vera Locke climb down out of the aircraft. She had just flown through the eye of the storm, and she came down the same way she'd done everything else that night, unhurried, complete, no wasted motion. And she stood a moment on the wet pad with one hand on the airframe, her head bowed, not for show. Just a woman past 50 who had spent everything she had, and was taking 1 second to stand still before she had to be a person again. Then her crew chiefs came to her, and she straightened, and put a hand on each of their shoulders and said something I couldn't hear that made one of them duck his head, and she went to her co-pilot and gripped his hand, and I understood that whatever was owed here she was going to pay outward first, to the 4 people who had flown it with her, before she took 1 ounce of it for herself. She would probably have paid it outward all night. She would never once have looked for me. But I went to her. I made myself cross that pad, past the men still coming down off it, into the space around the aircraft that everyone else was giving her, and I stood in front of her in the rain, Captain Wes Corbin, the ops officer, 11 days on the mountain, and I did the only thing there was to do, which was face it. She looked at me. The recognition came into her face, not anger. There was never any anger in her. That was the thing, just recognition. The tired, pale eyes settling on me and knowing me. The young man from the flight line who'd asked for her ID. I came to attention and I saluted her, and I held it. "Chief Locke," I said, and my voice was not as steady as I wanted it. "6 hours ago I ordered you off my flight line. I told you it wasn't a viewing area. I asked you for your identification." I made myself keep looking at her. I decided who you were in 2 seconds, and I was wrong about every part of it, and I want to say that to you out loud in front of your aircraft because you deserve to hear it said and I deserve to have to say it. I'm sorry. I have never been more wrong about anything in my life. She let me hold the salute a moment. Then she brought her own hand up, unhurried, and returned it, correct and complete, and we both dropped them together. And then she did the thing that finished the changing of me, the thing I have carried for the rest of my career and will carry out of it. She didn't tell me it was all right. It would have been easy and kind and false, and she didn't do it. She didn't crush me either. There wasn't a gram of "I told you so" anywhere in her, and God knows she'd earned the right to it. She just looked at me, and she was quiet a moment, choosing it, and then she said, "You were doing your job, Corbin. Your line was soft when you got here and you were making it hard, and that's the right instinct. Don't lose it." A pause, the rain on both of us. "But you looked at me and you saw gray hair and no patches and you decided you already knew the whole of it. That's the part to keep. Not the guarding of the line, the deciding you were done looking." She glanced back once at the dark aircraft ticking behind her, and then at me. "Every base has somebody standing at the edge of the light that nobody's bothered to actually see. Old crew chief nobody listens to anymore. Some quiet sergeant. The person who knows exactly the thing you need to know and has stopped offering it because young men with clipboards keep telling them to clear the line." She wasn't hard about it. That was the mercy in it and the weight of it both. You're going to command someday. When you do, before you decide what somebody is, look 1 second longer than you did tonight. That's all. That's the whole lesson. 1 second longer. "Yes, Chief," I said. It was all I had. She nodded once done with it. No ceremony. No lingering. The same economy she brought to everything. And she reached out and gripped my shoulder briefly. The way she'd gripped her crews, which I had not earned and which undid me completely. And then she turned to go find out whether the boy she'd flown out of the mountain was going to live. He lived. I want that said because a story like this owes you that. The surgeon opened him up within the hour and stopped the bleeding that would have killed him by midnight, and he was flown out to a proper hospital 2 days later, gray and hollow and alive. And the last I heard, years on, he was alive still, somewhere. A man walking around in the world with a wife and maybe children who existed because 10 of his friends carried him up a mountain in the dark, and one woman flew a valley to bring him down. I have commanded since. She was right that I would, and I have tried every command to be the officer who keeps the line hard, because she was right about that too. The instinct was a good one, and I've relieved men for letting a cordon go soft, and I'd do it again. But I have never again, not once, looked at a person standing at the edge of my light and decided in 2 seconds that I knew the whole of them. Not the quiet contractor nobody introduced. Not the old sergeant everybody talked over. Not the tired woman in the unmarked suit at the edge of the flight line watching a storm come over a ridge. I look 1 second longer. I was taught to, on a wet pad in the mountains, by the best pilot I have ever seen or heard of, who had every right to break me and instead spent 30 seconds of the most exhausted night of her life making sure I'd carry the right lesson out of it. People ask me sometimes, younger officers, when the topic of the great ones comes up, what it was actually like, the night Nighthawk flew the bowl. They've heard the story. Everybody in that theater heard the story. It got bigger every time it was told, the way those stories do. And they want me to tell them about the flying, the throat, the hover, the kinks, the impossible skill of it, and I do, because it was all of that and more, and it deserves the telling. But that's not the part I keep. The part I keep is a gray-haired woman standing outside a painted line in the rain, complying with the letter of a foolish young man's order, and not 1 gram more, telling him without heat that she was the only one on the base who could do the thing that was about to need doing, and being, in every particular, completely and quietly and overwhelmingly right. I ordered her away. Seconds later the klaxon went, and a colonel 2 valleys up spoke one word into the dark and the whole base stopped. And the word was her call sign, and it meant the mission was still on, because she would still go. She went, she brought them home, 11 men and a boy who lived. And the last of my certainty about what a person is worth by looking at them went home in the back of that aircraft too, and I have never wanted it back. I look 1 second longer now. That's the whole lesson. That's what Nighthawk taught me, on the night I'll tell my grandchildren about, standing at attention in the rain, saluting a window.